One small dance in a diner between a struggling waitress and her disabled son changed everything, changed the eye of a billionaire who would transform their lives, an entire community forever. Maria was only 27, but life had already made her look older than her years. Every morning she tied her hair into a messy bun, slipped into the simple uniform of the small-town diner, and forced a smile onto her tired face. The customers who came in for their coffee and eggs never thought twice about the young woman serving them. To most, she was just another waitress, moving from table to table, pen tucked behind her ear, balancing trays and cleaning spills. But behind that smile was a story that very few people knew, a story of sacrifice, endless work, and love that never gave up. Her son Ethan was the center of her world. He was 7 years old, small for his age, with soft brown eyes that lit up every time he laughed. Ethan had been born with cerebral palsy, which made it hard for him to walk like other kids. Some days his legs were stiff, and he struggled to move without falling. Other days he managed to take small steps, wobbling, but always trying. Doctors had told Maria early on that Ethan's life would be full of challenges. They gave her pamphlets filled with medical terms and endless lists of therapies, but what they couldn't give her was hope. Maria had decided that she would create that hope herself, no matter how hard it was. The diner job didn't pay much, but it kept the lights on in their little apartment. She worked double shifts most weeks, rushing to drop Ethan off at school in the mornings and picking him up afterward. On the days when her shift was too long, she brought him to the diner. The regular customers had grown used to the sight of Ethan sitting at the corner booth, crayons scattered across the table, his school bag leaning against his legs. He didn't complain. He loved being near his mother, watching her move gracefully between the tables. Almost as though she were dancing, Maria often thought about that dancing. Before life had turned so difficult, she had dreamed of becoming a dance instructor. When she was younger, she would spend hours practicing steps in front of the mirror, imagining herself teaching children the beauty of movement and rhythm. But when Ethan came into her life and his father walked out soon after, the dream was tucked away in a quiet corner of her heart. There was no time for dance lessons, no money for studios. Life became about survival, paying rent, buying groceries, making sure Ethan had his medications. Yet deep inside, the rhythm never left her. Sometimes late at night, she would sway with Ethan in her arms, humming soft tunes, letting the music of her soul carry her for just a few moments before the exhaustion pulled her back to reality at the diner. Maria carried herself with a quiet strength. She never snapped at rude customers, never showed when she was exhausted, and always kept her patience when someone complained about the food being too slow. But the truth was, her feet often ached so badly by the end of the night that she could barely walk home. Still, when she looked at Ethan waiting at the corner booth, swinging his legs and smiling up at her, she felt her strength return. He was her reason to keep going. He was the light she clung to in a world that often felt dark. Ethan adored his mother. To him, she was the strongest, kindest person in the world. He didn't notice how tired she looked or how often she worried about money. What he noticed was that she made everything seem possible. She encouraged him when he tried to walk across the diner floor, holding his little hands and cheering him on for every step. She laughed when he told silly jokes and always kissed his forehead when she tucked him into bed. More than anything, Ethan loved when his mother danced with him. It wasn't the kind of dance you saw on stages or in movies. It was simple, clumsy, but full of joy. She would hold his hands, let him take a step forward, then another, pretending he was leading the dance. Ethan's face would glow with pride as he moved, and Maria would smile through the tears she tried to hide. For those few minutes, the world didn't feel so heavy. Life was never easy for them. Bills piled up faster than Maria could pay them. Some nights she skipped dinner so Ethan could have a full plate. The apartment they lived in was small and drafty, with creaky floors and walls so thin she could hear the neighbors arguing. Still, Maria tried to make it feel like home. She painted the walls a soft yellow, bought second-hand curtains, and kept a small shelf of books and toys for Ethan. No matter how little they had, she made sure Ethan felt safe and loved. He never knew how hard she cried when he was asleep, or how many times she worried about not having enough for next month's rent. He only knew that his mother loved him, and that was enough for him. The people in town admired Maria, even if they didn't always say it out loud. The older ladies who came in for their morning tea noticed how gentle she was with Ethan. The truck drivers who stopped for late-night meals saw how she worked tirelessly without complaint. The other waitresses at the diner whispered about her strength, wondering how she managed everything on her own. But Maria didn't see herself as strong. She only saw a mother doing what she had to do. She often thought about her life, how different it was from the dreams she once had. But every time she felt bitterness creeping in, she reminded herself that Ethan was her gift, her reason. And if she had to sacrifice her dreams to give him a better life, she would do it 1,000 times over. Every day at the diner was almost the same. Maria would serve coffee, take orders, carry heavy trays, and clean tables. But what made her days brighter were the little moments with Ethan. When the diner was quiet, she would walk over to the corner booth and check his homework, or draw silly faces with him on the back of napkins. Sometimes she'd hum a song, and Ethan would giggle, asking her to dance just a little. She would take his hands, guide him onto the floor between the tables, and let him lead a step. The other customers often watched quietly, smiling at the sight of the boy's determination and the mother's love. Those dances were small, unnoticed by most of the world, but to Maria and Ethan, they were everything. They were proof that even in the middle of struggle, joy could exist. Maria's life was hard, but she carried it with grace. She didn't complain about the long hours or the aching feet. She didn't resent the customers who left small tips. She kept going, day after day, because love pushed her forward. Ethan's laughter gave her strength, his hugs gave her comfort, and his dreams gave her purpose. Though the world saw just a tired waitress in a small-town diner, in reality, she was a warrior, quiet, gentle, and unshakably devoted. And in those quiet evenings, when the sun set outside the diner windows and Ethan's small steps turned into a proud little dance, Maria felt something stir inside her. It was the memory of her old dream, the one she thought she had lost forever. She still carried the rhythm in her heart, and even though her life was filled with struggles, the music was still alive. She didn't know it yet, but the small steps she shared with Ethan in that little diner would one day change her life in ways she could never imagine. It was a cold evening when Richard first stepped into the little diner. He had not planned to be there. In fact, the only reason he ended up in that part of town was because his driver had taken a wrong turn on the way. Back from a business meeting, Richard was a man used to 5-star hotels, private jets, and restaurants where the tablecloths were silk and the wine cost more than most people's rent. But that night, tired from travel and too hungry to wait for another stop, he asked the driver to pull over when he saw the glowing neon sign of the diner. The diner was simple, nothing fancy. The booths were a little worn, the smell of coffee and fried food filled the air, and the sound of plates clinking came from the kitchen. Richard walked in wearing his tailored suit, his expensive watch catching the dim light. For a moment, the room seemed to notice him, this stranger, who clearly didn't belong. But Richard didn't care about the stares. He just wanted a hot meal and a moment of peace. He had built a fortune, but money had never filled the emptiness in his life. His wife had passed away years earlier, and his daughter had grown distant. He was upset at the father who was always too busy chasing success. Despite his billions, Richard often felt like the loneliest man in the world. Maria noticed him right away. She had learned to read people in seconds. Some customers came in with a smile. Some came in with complaints, and some, like this man, came in carrying the weight of something heavier than tiredness. She walked over to his table with her usual gentle smile and handed him a menu. "Good evening. Can I get you something to drink while you decide?" she asked. Her voice was kind, without judgment, treating him the same way she treated every customer, no matter who they were. Richard appreciated that. He was used to people recognizing him, rushing to impress him, or acting nervous in his presence. But this waitress looked at him as though he were just another man passing through. It was oddly refreshing. As Maria moved back toward the counter, Richard's eyes wandered around the diner. That was when he noticed Ethan. The boy sat at a corner booth, a notebook open in front of him, his small legs swinging under the table. There was something fragile about him, yet his eyes carried a spark of joy that caught Richard off guard. A few minutes later, Richard's food arrived, and as he began to eat, a soft sound of laughter made him look up again. This time, he saw Maria walking over to her son, leaning down to whisper something that made him giggle. She held out her hand, and to Richard's surprise, Ethan slowly stood up. At first, it looked like a simple stretch, but then Maria began to guide him, step by step, across the narrow space between the tables. Ethan's legs wobbled, his movements awkward, but his mother held his hands gently, letting him take the lead. Richard realized they were dancing. Not the polished, elegant dancing he was used to seeing at gala events, but something far more raw and beautiful. Ethan took a shaky step forward, and Maria followed, as though he were in charge of the rhythm. She laughed softly, encouraging him, clapping when he managed to stay upright. The other customers turned to watch, their expressions softening as the boy tried his best to move with confidence. For a man like Richard, who had attended countless grand parties filled with professional dancers and musicians, this little moment in a small-town diner should have meant nothing. But he found himself unable to look away. The sight of a mother letting her disabled son lead a dance, celebrating every small step as though it were a victory, stirred something deep inside him. It was pure. It was love in its most simple and powerful form. He felt his chest tighten, an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He thought of his own daughter. Emily, when she was Ethan's age, she had begged him to attend her school recital. He remembered promising he would go, but a last-minute meeting with investors had kept him away. She had performed without him in the audience, and he had excused himself later by saying, "I'm building a future for you." But Emily had not wanted money or luxury. She had wanted her father's presence. Watching Maria with Ethan, Richard realized just how much he had missed by chasing the wrong kind of success. The dance didn't last long. After a few minutes, Ethan grew tired, and Maria kissed his forehead before guiding him back to the booth. She adjusted his jacket, tucked the crayons back into his bag, and ruffled his hair with the tenderness of someone whose whole world revolved around that boy. Then she went back to serving customers as though nothing extraordinary had happened. But Richard knew he had just witnessed something extraordinary indeed. He sat in silence for a long while, forgetting about his food. His mind kept replaying the image of Ethan's determined steps and Maria's patient encouragement. He thought about how different this woman was from the people he usually met: investors, business partners, socialites who measured worth in money and status. Maria had nothing of that, yet she carried herself with a dignity that came from love and resilience. And the boy. His bravery reminded Richard of how fragile yet strong the human spirit could be. When Maria returned to his table to ask if he needed anything else, Richard found himself studying her more closely. She looked tired, yes, with faint shadows under her eyes. But there was warmth in her smile, and her movements were graceful, almost like the dancer she once dreamed of becoming. He wanted to ask about the boy, about her life, but he stopped himself. He didn't want to pry or appear pitying. Instead, he nodded politely and said the food was good. As the night went on, Richard stayed longer than he intended. Something kept him rooted to the booth, sipping his coffee slowly, observing the rhythm of the diner. He noticed how Maria never rushed Ethan, how she balanced her job with motherhood so seamlessly, as if it were second nature. He noticed how the boy beamed whenever she looked at him, and how she never seemed embarrassed by his condition, only proud. For a man who had built empires, it was humbling to see how this woman built her world from love alone. When he finally left the diner, the cold air outside hit him sharply. He climbed into his luxury car, but the soft leather seats and expensive surroundings suddenly felt hollow. His mind kept drifting back to the image of Ethan dancing, Maria laughing, and the quiet joy that filled that modest diner. It was unlike anything in his world of wealth and power. It felt real. It felt human. And without realizing it, Richard knew this was not the last time he would step into that little diner. Something had touched him deeply, something he couldn't quite explain. And he felt a pull to return, not for the food, but for the story unfolding within those walls. Richard had never been the kind of man to linger in small places. His life was always about moving forward, fast planes, sharp meetings, quick decisions. But after that first evening, something inside him would not let go of the image of the young boy struggling to dance and the mother who turned every shaky step into a celebration. He told himself it was nothing, just a passing moment. But the memory followed him everywhere, in the silence of his hotel room, in the back seat of his car. Even during board meetings where his mind was supposed to be sharp and focused, so he went back. At first he thought it would be just once more, out of curiosity. But one visit turned into another, and soon the waitress and her little boy became a quiet part of his world. He never announced himself, never let anyone know who he really was. To Maria, he was simply another customer, polite, quiet, always sitting at the same booth near the window. She greeted him with the same gentle smile she gave everyone else, and that, strangely, made him feel more welcome than all the formal bows and handshakes he usually received. Over time, Richard noticed things about Maria that most people might miss. He saw how carefully she balanced her trays, even when her hands were clearly tired. He saw how she checked on every customer, remembering their names and their favorite orders, making each person feel valued. But what struck him the most was how she treated Ethan. No matter how busy the diner became, she always found a moment to glance at him, to smile, to whisper encouragement when he tried to practice walking across the floor. One night, Richard stayed later than usual, sipping coffee long after his plate had been cleared. The diner had grown quiet, with only a few customers left. Maria finally had a chance to sit with her son and Richard from his booth. Watch the scene unfold like a story he couldn't turn away from. Ethan wanted to show his mother something he had drawn. His little hands held up a picture of two stick figures, one taller, one smaller, dancing together. Maria's eyes softened as she looked at it, and she clapped as though it were the most beautiful art in the world. Then Ethan asked if they could dance again. Maria hesitated, glancing around the diner to make sure she wasn't neglecting her work. But seeing the eagerness in her son's face, she gave in. She took his hands, stood up, and once again let him guide her across the floor. This time, Richa saw more than just a dance. He saw a boy who refused to let his condition stop him. He saw a mother who turned weakness into strength simply by believing in her child. And he saw the joy that filled the space between them, a joy that no amount of money could ever buy. When Maria guided Ethan back to the booth, Richard couldn't hold back his words any longer. He stood up, walked over, and gently said, "He's very brave." Maria looked up, a little startled. Few customers ever spoke directly about Ethan. Most only offered polite smiles or avoided eye contact altogether. For a moment, she seemed unsure how to respond. Then she smiled faintly and said, "He tries his best every day. That's all that matters." Richard nodded, his eyes lingering on the boy who was now scribbling happily in his notebook. "He doesn't just try, he inspires. Do you know how rare that is?" Maria tilted her head, curious. There was something in the man's voice, a kind of weight that didn't match the simple words. "Thank you," she replied softly. "I just want him to believe in himself. The world already tells him too many times what he cannot do." Her words struck Richard deeply. He thought about his own daughter again, how many times he had unknowingly told her she couldn't matter more than his work. He thought about all the ways he had failed to encourage her, all the ways he had chosen business over family. Here was a woman with nothing, no fortune, no help. Number partner to share the burden, yet she gave her child everything he needed most: belief, love, and presence. That night, Richard found himself staying longer at her table. For the first time in years, he spoke not as a businessman, but as a person. He asked about Ethan's favorite songs, and Maria laughed as she described how he loved anything with a fast beat, even though his steps were slow. He asked if Ethan liked school, and Maria admitted that while the boy struggled with some things, he was eager to learn and loved drawing more than anything. As the conversation flowed, Richard noticed something unusual in himself. He wasn't thinking about numbers, stocks, or deadlines. He wasn't calculating the value of anything. He was simply listening, and it felt different. It felt real when Ethan grew sleepy and leaned against his mother's arm. Maria excused herself, saying it was time to take him home. Richard watched them leave, her guiding hand steady on the boy's shoulder. He realized then that he didn't want this to be just a passing encounter. There was something about this small family that called to him, something that reminded him of the humanity he had lost along the way. Over the following weeks, Richard continued to visit. He became less of a stranger and more of a quiet presence in the diner. He learned that Maria worked nearly every day because rent was hard to cover. He learned that Ethan went to therapy twice a week, and though it was costly, Maria never complained. He learned that she carried her life like a dance, graceful on the outside, but with effort and sacrifice hidden beneath every step. One evening, Richard found himself confessing something he rarely admitted to anyone. "I had a daughter," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the coffee cup in front of him. "Still do. But I lost her in a way. Not because she's gone, but because I wasn't there when it mattered." Maria looked at him with gentle eyes. The same eyes that always softened when she looked at her son. "Children don't just need care," she said. "They need presence. They need to know they're seen." Richard swallowed hard. The words cut deeper than she could ever know. For years he had told himself that building wealth was for his family, that absence was the price of success. But looking at Maria and Ethan, he saw the truth. Love was not measured in gifts or money. It was measured in time, in shared moments, in small dances, in the middle of a diner. That night, as he drove away, Richard felt something shifting inside him. The walls he had built around his heart began to crack. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't thinking about deals or profits. He was thinking about a little boy who refused to give up, and a mother who gave everything for her child, and though he didn't yet know how, Richard felt a pull to become part of their story, not as a customer, not as a stranger, but as someone who could help carry the weight they had been shouldering alone. Richard had spent his whole life believing that money was the answer to everything. If something was broken, he could buy a new one. If someone was sick, he could afford the best doctors. If a problem arose, he simply wrote a check, and the problem disappeared. But the more he visited the diner, the more he realized there were things in life money could not simply fix, like loneliness, like regret. Like the bond between a mother and her child, he had kept his identity hidden from Maria for weeks. To her, he was just Richard, a quiet man in an expensive suit who liked his coffee black and always tipped generously. But deep down he knew that one day she would find out who he really was. He wasn't ashamed of his wealth. He was ashamed of how he had used it in the past, how he had built walls instead of bridges, how he had chased numbers while the people who mattered most slipped away. One rainy evening, Richard arrived at the diner again. The smell of coffee and fresh bread filled the air. Ethan was sitting at his usual corner booth, drawing with crayons, his tongue sticking out in concentration. Maria moved gracefully between tables, balancing plates and flashing her warm smile at customers. To anyone else, it was an ordinary night. But Richard had made a decision. Tonight, he would stop being just a stranger in her story. After the dinner rush slowed down, Richard called Maria over. She wiped her hands on her apron and came to his booth, her smile tired but kind. "You always seem busy," Richard began. "Do you ever get a moment for yourself?" Maria gave a small laugh. "Not really. Between work and Ethan, there's not much time left for me. But that's okay. He's my world. Everything else can wait." Her words touched him. He hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "What did you dream about? Before life became so heavy?" Maria blinked at him, a little surprised by the question. Most customers never asked anything personal. She looked down for a second, as if afraid to share. Then she whispered, "I wanted to dance. I wanted to teach children how to find joy in movement. But dreams don't pay bills, do they? Reality does." Richard leaned forward, his voice softer now. "And if reality could be changed?" Maria frowned, not understanding. "What do you mean?" It was then that Richard decided to tell her the truth. He explained who he was, how he wasn't just a traveler passing through, but a billionaire entrepreneur who had built empires across industries. Maria's eyes widened, disbelief written all over her face. For a moment, she thought he might be joking. But the calm seriousness in his eyes told her it was true. "Why are you here?" she asked quietly, confusion lacing her voice. "Why would someone like you spend time in a place like this?" Richard's throat tightened. "Because sometimes the richest places are not made of gold. They're made of moments like the ones I see between you and your son." Maria looked down, unsure of what to say. She had always believed that people with wealth lived in another world, far away from her struggles. Yet here was this man speaking to her as if her small life mattered more than anything he had known in his world of luxury. Richard continued, his tone steady but filled with emotion. "Maria, you have something money cannot buy. You give your son hope. You make him believe in himself even when the world says otherwise. In watching you, I realize that is the kind of wealth I've been missing all my life." Maria shook her head, embarrassed. "I don't know what you're trying to say. I'm just a waitress doing the best I can for my boy." "No," Richard said firmly. "You're not just anything. You are strong. You are brave. And you're the kind of person this world needs more of." He paused, then finally revealed the offer he had been holding in his heart. "I want to help you. I want to build something with you. You said you dreamed of teaching dance. I can make that happen. I will fund a studio where children, especially children like Ethan, can learn to dance, to move, to feel alive. You won't have to worry about money, rent, or bills. You'll just have to do what you were born to do, teach joy." Maria froze, her heart pounding. For a second she wondered if she had misheard him. A stranger, no. Not just a stranger, but a billionaire, was offering to change her life completely. She wanted to laugh, to cry, to run away all at once. I can't accept that," she stammered. "It feels like charity. I don't want pity." Richard shook his head quickly. "This is not pity. This is faith. I am not giving you something because I feel sorry for you. I am giving you a chance because you deserve it. Because your strength and your love have inspired me more than anything else in years." Maria's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away. She looked over at Ethan, who was still happily drawing, unaware of the life-changing conversation happening beside him. She thought about all the nights she had cried herself to sleep, wondering how long she could keep holding everything together. She thought about her son's smile when he danced, the pure happiness in his eyes. Was it possible that her old dream, the one she had buried so long ago, could actually come alive again? "Why me?" she whispered. "You could invest in anything, anyone. Why choose me?" Richard's voice grew softer. "Because for the first time in years I see something real. I've built towers, companies, and fortunes, but none of them made me feel alive. Watching you and your son reminded me of what I've lost. You gave me hope, Maria, and now I want to give you a future." Maria was silent for a long moment. She felt torn between fear and hope. Part of her wanted to say no, to retreat into the safety of what she already knew. But another part, the part that had once dreamed of music, movement, and laughter, was whispering that maybe, just maybe, this was the chance she had been waiting for. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling. "If I say yes, it won't just be for me. It has to be for Ethan and for kids like him. Children who are told they can't, when really, they just need someone to believe they can." Richard's face lit up with the first genuine smile he had felt in years. "That's exactly what I want to." The rain outside tapped against the diner windows, as if marking the beginning of something new. For Maria, it was the first time in a long while that hope didn't feel like a distant dream. For Richard, it was the first time he felt his wealth could finally serve a purpose greater than himself. That night, Maria took Ethan home. She tucked him into bed and sat quietly by his side. She watched him sleep, his little chest rising and falling, his small hands curled around his favorite crayon. And for the first time in years, she let herself imagine a future not filled with endless struggle but with music, dancing, and children discovering joy in their own small steps. Richard, driving back to his world of glass towers and boardrooms, felt something stir in his heart. It wasn't business. It wasn't power. It was the feeling of finally choosing the right kind of investment, Not in companies, but in people. And he knew this was only the beginning. Maria never truly believed the offer was real until she saw it with her own eyes. Weeks after that rainy evening, Richard kept his promise. He didn't just talk about building a dance studio, he did it. The old warehouse on the edge of town, a building most people had ignored for years, was suddenly filled with workers. They painted the walls, fixed the roof, and polished the wooden floors until they shone. Every day, Maria passed by with Ethan, watching the transformation in disbelief. When the studio was finally ready, Richard invited Maria and Ethan to step inside. She pushed the door open and gasped. The place was beautiful. The floors were wide and smooth, perfect for dancing. Bright mirrors lined the walls, reflecting the soft golden light from the new lamps. There were colorful mats for children to sit on, racks for costumes, and even a small corner filled with instruments for rhythm exercises. It looked nothing like the broken warehouse she remembered. It looked like a dream brought to life. Ethan was the first to run or rather wobble inside. His steps were unsteady, but his face glowed with excitement. "Mama, look. It's so big," he shouted, his voice echoing in the wide room. He twirled in circles, laughing as if he already owned the place. Maria felt tears prick her eyes. For so long, she had taught her son little dances between diner tables. Now he had a space where he could move freely, where other children could join him, where joy could spread like music through the air. Richard stood quietly by the door, watching them. He didn't interrupt. He just smiled as he saw the mother and son exploring the studio. This was what he had wanted, not to hand Maria money, but to give her the stage she deserved. He saw her eyes shine as she walked across the polished floor, her hands brushing against the mirrors. It was as if he had given her back a piece of her soul. The studio opened a few weeks later. Word spread quickly around town, and soon parents began bringing their children. Some were shy, some were energetic, and some, like Ethan, had disabilities that made them feel out of place elsewhere. Maria welcomed them all. She didn't care if a child could move perfectly or not. To her, every step, every sway, every smile was a victory. She taught them not just to dance, but to feel music inside their hearts. Her teaching style was different from anything people had seen. She didn't shout commands or demand perfection. Instead, she encouraged. She clapped for every attempt, cheered for every small progress, and made every child feel like a star. Parents stood at the back of the room, often moved to tears, watching their children light up with confidence. Many of them said the same thing afterward. "No one has ever believed in my child the way you do." For Ethan, the studio became his safe haven. Surrounded by other children, he felt less alone. He learned to balance better, to take stronger steps, and most importantly, to lead small dances where his classmates followed him. The boy who once struggled to move across a diner floor now led circles of children, his laughter ringing louder than the music. Maria watched him bloom, and her heart swelled with pride. Richard visited often. At first, he stayed in the background, not wanting to draw attention. He sat on the benches, watching the children dance and the joy that filled the room. Slowly, though, people began to notice who he really was. Some whispered in surprise. Others approached him nervously, but Richard always waved it off. "I'm just here to watch," he would say, with a gentle smile. What few people knew was that the studio wasn't just changing Maria's and Ethan's lives, it was changing Richard's too. For years, he had lived in a world of polished boardrooms and endless contracts. But here, surrounded by children laughing and clapping, he felt human again. One day, he even joined in, clumsily copying the steps the kids were doing. They giggled at his stiff movements, and for the first time in decades, Richard laughed so hard that his eyes watered. The biggest change came with his daughter, Emily. When she learned about the studio from the news because word of the Billionaire, funding a community dance program spread far beyond town, she reached out. For years, she had kept her distance from him, angry about the times he had chosen business over family. But when she saw what he had done for Maria and Ethan, something softened in her heart. She visited the studio one afternoon, unsure if her father would welcome her. To her surprise, Richard nearly cried when he saw her. He introduced her to Maria and Ethan, his voice shaking with pride as if this reunion was the biggest gift the studio had given him. Emily watched the children dance, watched Maria's kindness, and realized her father was no longer the man who had missed her childhood. He was different, now softer, wiser, finally present. The studio continued to grow. It became more than just a place for dance. It became a community center, a safe space where families gathered, where children learned to trust themselves, and where people found hope in each other. Maria's life changed completely. She no longer lived from paycheck to paycheck, worrying about whether she could buy groceries or pay rent. She had stability, but more importantly, she had a purpose. She was living her dream, and her dream was lifting others with her. For Richard, watching Maria succeed was like watching a flower bloom in the middle of a desert. He had given her the tools, but she had given the place its soul. The studio wasn't his achievement, it was hers. And in helping her, he found something money had never been able to buy. Peace. Ethan grew stronger each year. He still faced challenges, but he faced them with courage. Whenever he stumbled, Maria would remind him, every dancer falls. But the music never stops, and he would stand again, ready to keep moving. His confidence inspired other children who once felt shy or broken. They looked at him and thought, if he can dance, so can I. Looking back, Maria sometimes thought about the diner, about the nights she worked until her feet ached, about the tears she hid from Ethan. She realized those struggles had prepared her for this. They had given her the strength to teach children not just how to dance, but how to believe in themselves. And Richard, sitting quietly at the back of the studio, often thought about the path that had led him there. A wrong turn, a small diner, a shaky dance between a mother and her son that was all it had taken to change the course of 3 lives forever. He had spent decades building an empire, but this small studio in a quiet town became the greatest legacy of his life. In the end, it wasn't money, power, or fame that mattered. It was love, the kind of love Maria gave her son, the kind of love that spread through the walls of the studio. It's the kind of love that healed even the heart of a lonely billionaire. And as the music played and the children danced, the world outside seemed a little brighter, a little kinder. All because one mother let her son lead a dance step, and one man chose to follow.